I never thought I'd be the kind of person to let my life spiral into chaos, but looking back, the signs were there all along. My name is Lisa, and for the past 5 years, I've been in what most people would consider a stable, predictable relationship. My boyfriend, Ryan, is dependable and kind, and he's always been great with my son, Ethan, who's now 9. Our life together was comfortable, a steady routine of school drop-offs, family dinners, and weekend soccer games. But somewhere along the way, comfort began to feel like complacency, and I started to question if this was all my life would ever be. It all began at one of Ethan's soccer practices. Ethan had always loved soccer, and his enthusiasm was infectious, the kind of thing that made me look forward to watching him play. Ryan was often busy with work, so I was the one who attended most of the practices and games, cheering from the sidelines with the other parents. That's where I met Coach Mark. Mark wasn't what I expected from a youth soccer coach. He was in his late 30s, with an easy charm and a confident presence that made him stand out. He had this way of making everyone feel at ease, cracking jokes with the kids and chatting effortlessly with the parents. From the very first practice, I noticed him, though I tried to brush it off as nothing more than casual admiration. But the more practices I attended, the more I found myself lingering after they ended, joining the small group of parents who hung around to chat with him. At first, our conversations were innocent, small talk about Ethan's progress on the team, suggestions for drills he could practice at home, even a shared laugh about the chaos of managing kids' schedules. But as the weeks went on, our interactions grew longer and more personal. Mark had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room, his attention unwavering and his smiles disarming. It wasn't long before I started looking forward to those moments more than I should have. I told myself it was harmless, that there was nothing wrong with enjoying a friendly conversation. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, after practice, Ethan ran off to grab his water bottle, and I found myself alone with Mark by the field. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the park, and the air was filled with the sounds of kids laughing and parents packing up. "You know," Mark said, leaning casually against the goalpost, "Ethan's really got potential. You've done a great job raising him." "Thank you," I said, feeling a flush of pride and something else I couldn't quite name. "He's a good kid." Mark nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "He gets it from you, I bet." The compliment caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. There was something in his tone, something unspoken but undeniable, that made my heart race. "You're too kind," I said finally, forcing a laugh to break the tension. But from that moment on, the dynamic between us shifted. I started to notice the way his gaze lingered a little too long, the way he always seemed to find a reason to stand a little closer. And I hated to admit it, but I didn't mind. At home, things with Ryan felt increasingly strained. He was as reliable as ever, but I found myself pulling away, making excuses to avoid moments of intimacy or connection. "You've been distant lately," he said one night as we sat on the couch watching TV. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I said quickly, brushing off his concern. "Just tired." But the truth was, my thoughts were consumed by Mark. I replayed our conversations in my mind, analyzing every word, every glance, as though searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The turning point came one rainy afternoon after a particularly grueling practice. Most of the parents had left early to avoid the storm, but Ethan insisted on staying to finish the scrimmage. As the rain began to fall harder, Mark called for a break and sent the kids to their parents. Ethan ran off to grab his bag, leaving me and Mark alone under the shelter of the park's small pavilion. "You didn't have to stay in this weather," Mark said, his voice low and warm. "Ethan wouldn't have forgiven me if I made him leave," I said, laughing softly. Mark smiled, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The sound of the rain filled the silence, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "You're really dedicated," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "So are you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The space between us felt electric, charged with something neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. And in that moment, I made a choice I couldn't take back. The moment it happened, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. As the rain poured around us, Mark leaned in, his hand brushing lightly against mine. For a brief second, I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to step back, to walk away, to stop this before it went any further. But instead, I stayed frozen in place, letting the spark between us ignite into something far more dangerous. His kiss was brief, almost tentative, as if he were testing the waters. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, waiting for some kind of reaction. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but before I could speak, Ethan ran up to us, holding his bag above his head to shield himself from the rain. "Mom, let's go. I'm soaked," Ethan shouted, his voice pulling me back to reality. I stepped away from Mark, my mind spinning as I grabbed Ethan's hand and ushered him toward the car. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see, or feel, if I did. The drive home was a blur, Ethan chatting happily about the scrimmage while I nodded and forced smiles at all the right moments. My thoughts, however, were consumed by what had just happened. What did it mean? What had I done? And why, despite the guilt twisting in my stomach, couldn't I stop thinking about it? At home, Ryan greeted us with his usual warmth, asking about practice and offering to dry Ethan's wet gear. His kindness only made the weight of my guilt heavier, and I found myself avoiding his gaze, retreating to the kitchen to busy myself with dinner. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that the kiss had been a fluke, a momentary lapse in judgment that meant nothing. I avoided Mark at practice, staying on the far side of the field and leaving as soon as Ethan was done. But the harder I tried to distance myself, the more I found myself replaying that moment in my mind. It didn't take long for Mark to notice my avoidance. One evening, after practice, he caught up with me as I was loading Ethan's bag into the car. "Hey," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was nearby. "Can we talk?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, keeping my voice low. "Lisa, please," he pressed, his tone earnest. "I didn't mean to make things complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, both thrilling and terrifying. "Mark, this has to stop," I said firmly, though my resolve wavered as he stepped closer. "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But I don't want it to." I opened my mouth to respond, but Ethan's voice interrupted us, calling from the back seat. "Mom, are we going?" "Coming." I called back, using the excuse to turn away from Mark. "This has to stop," I repeated, more to myself than to him, as I climbed into the car. But despite my words, it didn't stop. Despite my best intentions, I couldn't stay away from Mark. I told myself I could manage the situation, keep it from spiraling out of control, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something intoxicating about the way he made me feel, wanted, alive, like I was more than just Ethan's mom or Ryan's girlfriend. And that feeling was something I hadn't realized I was starving for until it was too late. At practices, I found myself stealing glances in his direction, my heart skipping a beat whenever our eyes met. He was careful not to push too hard, but there was a quiet persistence in the way he lingered near me after practice, finding excuses to talk or offer advice about Ethan's progress. I tried to keep our interactions professional, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One Friday evening, Ethan had a late practice, and most of the parents had left early. Ryan was working late, so I stayed until the end, sitting alone on the bleachers while the kids scrimmaged under the stadium lights. When practice ended, Ethan ran off with a friend to grab a snack from the vending machines, leaving me and Mark alone by the field. "You didn't have to stay this late," Mark said as he approached, his tone casual but his eyes searching mine. "I wanted to," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. He sat down beside me, his presence both comforting and unnerving. "Lisa," he began, his voice low, "I know this is complicated, but I can't ignore how I feel about you. Mark, we can't do this, I said, though the words felt weak even as I said them. He reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. I know, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. But tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll stop. I opened my mouth to say the words, to put an end to whatever this was, but they wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, the pull between us too strong to resist. For a moment, the world faded away, and all I could think about was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person who mattered. That night marked the beginning of something I couldn't control. Mark and I began exchanging texts, at first, innocent messages about practice schedules and Ethan's progress, but they quickly became more personal. We'd talk late into the night, sharing pieces of ourselves that we'd never shared with anyone else. I told him about my doubts, my fears, the parts of myself I felt I'd lost over the years. And he listened, offering words of encouragement and understanding that felt like a lifeline. But as much as I tried to compartmentalize what was happening, it began to seep into every aspect of my life. Ryan noticed the change in me, though he couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. "You've been distracted lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Work's just been hectic, that's all." He nodded, accepting my explanation, but his concern lingered. The secrecy of my relationship with Mark was both exhilarating and exhausting. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, paranoid that someone would notice the way we lingered near each other at practice or the subtle glances we exchanged. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. One evening, after Ethan's game, Mark offered to stay behind and help clean up the field. Ryan had come to the game, but he left early to finish a project for work, leaving Ethan and me to head home on our own. As Ethan ran ahead to the car, Mark pulled me aside near the bleachers. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "Neither can I," he admitted, his gaze intense. "But I don't want to lose you." The weight of his words hung between us, and for a moment, I considered walking away, ending things once and for all. But instead, I stepped closer, my resolve crumbling under the intensity of his gaze. "Mark," I whispered, my voice breaking. Before I could say anything else, he kissed me, and this time, I didn't resist. I told myself it was just one kiss, one moment of weakness that didn't have to mean anything. But the truth was, it meant everything. The lines between Mark and me had blurred beyond recognition, and I knew there was no going back to the way things were. Every time I saw him, every time we exchanged a glance or a text, it was like I was feeding a fire that I couldn't seem to extinguish. At home, the tension between Ryan and me grew thicker with every passing day. He was still as kind and attentive as ever, but I found myself withdrawing more and more, the weight of my guilt making it impossible to meet his eyes. "You've been so distant lately," he said one evening as we sat at the dinner table with Ethan. "Is there something going on?" "No," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "I've just been busy, that's all." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push the issue. Instead, he nodded and turned his attention back to Ethan, who was excitedly recounting a play he'd made during practice. I watched them, my heart aching with the knowledge of how much I was risking. Mark and I tried to keep our interactions discreet, but the secrecy only added to the intensity. We found stolen moments to talk after practices, exchanged texts late at night, and once, during a particularly slow afternoon, he called me just to hear my voice. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said softly, his words sending a thrill through me even as they deepened my guilt. But the affair wasn't as invisible as I'd hoped. At the boutique where I worked, one of my co-workers, Jenna, pulled me aside one afternoon. "You've been glowing lately," she teased. "What's the secret?" I laughed it off, but her words stuck with me. Was I really that transparent? Did people notice the way I lit up when I talked about Ethan's practices or the way my phone seemed to buzz more often than usual? My paranoia only grew when, one evening, Ryan asked to see my phone. "I just need to check something," he said casually, holding out his hand. My heart raced as I handed it over, silently praying that I'd remembered to delete the texts from Mark. He scrolled for a moment before handing it back, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Thanks," he said, his tone as casual as ever. The close call rattled me, but it didn't stop me from continuing down the path I knew was leading to disaster. Mark had become my escape, my secret, my addiction. And no matter how much I hated myself for what I was doing, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Things came to a head one evening after a game. Ryan had stayed late at work, so it was just Ethan and me at the field. Mark lingered after the other parents had left, his eyes finding mine across the bleachers. "We need to talk," he said quietly, nodding toward a secluded corner near the parking lot. I followed him, my heart pounding as I glanced over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "This isn't a good idea," I said as we stopped near the edge of the field. "None of this is a good idea," Mark replied, his voice low and urgent. "But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way about you." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Mark, we can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to Ryan. It's not fair to your wife." "I know," he said, his gaze intense. "But it's not that simple, is it?" Before I could respond, Ethan called out to me from the car, his voice cutting through the tension. "Mom, are we going home?" "I have to go," I said, stepping away from Mark. As I drove home, Ethan chatting happily in the back seat, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark's words. He was right, it wasn't simple. Nothing about this was. But as I pulled into the driveway and saw Ryan waiting on the porch, his smile warm and genuine, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, and sooner or later, something would have to give. Every stolen moment with Mark felt like a rush, but the spaces in between, the long silences at home, the half-truths I told Ryan, the fleeting glances Ethan gave me when he thought I wasn't looking, those moments were suffocating. I knew I was running out of time. The lies I told to keep everything afloat were piling up, and the cracks in my carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. Ryan, ever patient, tried to reach out to me in his quiet way. "Lisa," he said one night as we lay in bed, the room heavy with unspoken tension. "I feel like you're somewhere else these days. Is there something you want to talk about?" "No," I said quickly, turning away from him. "I'm just tired." But tired didn't begin to cover it. I was exhausted, by the deceit, by the guilt, by the constant fear that everything I had built was one misplaced word or one stray glance away from crumbling. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Mark and I tried to be careful, but the intensity between us made it impossible to stay invisible. At practices, I caught Jenna watching me from the corner of her eye, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. Once, she even teased me in the break room. "So, how's Ethan's coach?" she asked casually, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice even. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Oh, no reason. You two just seem close." The remark sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a laugh and changed the subject. Still, the encounter left me rattled. How much had Jenna noticed? How many others had picked up on the subtle tension between Mark and me? The breaking point came one evening after a game. Ryan, for the first time in weeks, had come to watch. He sat on the bleachers, cheering for Ethan with an enthusiasm that made my heart ache. Mark, ever professional on the field, kept his distance, but I couldn't help the way my eyes flicked to him every few minutes, searching for some sign of acknowledgement. After the game, as the kids swarmed the snack table, Ryan offered to help pack up the gear. I stayed behind, chatting with a few parents, trying to act as normal as possible. But when I turned to grab Ethan's water bottle, I found Mark standing closer than I expected. "Lisa," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Can we talk?" "Not now," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder to where Ryan was helping Ethan untie his cleats. When, then? Mark pressed, his eyes scanning mine. I shook my head, my chest tightening with panic. This has to stop, Mark, I said, my voice trembling. Is that really what you want? He asked, his tone soft but insistent. Before I could answer, Ryan's voice called out. Lisa. Everything okay? I turned to see him watching us, his expression curious but not yet suspicious. Forcing a smile, I nodded. Coming. As I walked back to join Ryan and Ethan, I could feel Mark's eyes on me, the weight of his presence pressing against my back like a physical force. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Ryan and I sat together in the living room. He was quiet, his eyes fixed on the TV, but I could feel the questions simmering beneath the surface. Finally, he turned to me. That was him, wasn't it? Who? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The coach, Ryan said evenly. I've seen the way he looks at you. The way you look at him. My heart stopped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Ryan, it's not what you think, I said quickly, my words tumbling over each other. Then tell me what it is, he said, his voice calm but laced with hurt. Because whatever it is, it's been eating you alive for weeks. The air between us felt like it might shatter under the weight of his words. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But the fear of losing him, of losing everything, kept me silent. Instead, I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. It's nothing, I said finally. You're imagining things. Ryan studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give him. Finally, he sighed and stood. I hope you're right, he said quietly. For all our sakes. As he walked away, the reality of what I had done settled over me like a storm cloud. The life I had tried so hard to keep intact was crumbling around me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Ryan's words echoed in my mind for days, I hope you're right. For all our sakes. They carried the weight of a storm I could feel approaching, one that I wasn't sure I'd survive. Every moment we shared after that night felt like a test, a quiet, unspoken challenge to prove him wrong. But how could I, when the truth was the very thing I was trying to bury? Mark, meanwhile, was harder to avoid than ever. At practices, his presence was magnetic, pulling me toward him even when I tried to stay away. Every glance, every lingering moment when our paths crossed, felt like it carried the weight of an unspoken conversation. And it wasn't just me, Jenna's knowing looks at the boutique grew more frequent, and even some of the other parents seemed to exchange glances when Mark and I spoke. Lisa, Jenna said one afternoon as we folded clothes together, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. You know, people talk. What are you talking about? I asked, keeping my voice light even as my heart pounded. She shrugged, giving me a pointed look. Just saying. If there's something you don't want people to know, you might want to be more careful. Her words left me rattled. How much had she seen? And worse, how much had she told others? The tension at home was almost unbearable. Ryan's patience had its limits, and while he hadn't confronted me again, his silences were louder than any argument. He spent more time at work, and when he was home, he focused all his energy on Ethan. It was clear he was pulling away, and I couldn't blame him. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Ryan and I sat in the living room, the TV flickering with a show neither of us was watching. We need to talk, he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to stay calm. About what? Ryan turned to me, his eyes searching mine. About us. About whatever it is that's been going on. There's nothing going on, I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. Ryan sighed, leaning back against the couch. Do you think I'm stupid, Lisa? Do you think I don't see it? See what? I asked, though the tremble in my voice betrayed me. He shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and hurt. The way you act around him. The way you've been distant. I don't know what's going on, but I know it's not nothing. I opened my mouth to deny it, to deflect, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. Ryan let out a bitter laugh. You know, I always thought we had something real. Something solid. But now, I don't even know who you are anymore. His words cut deeper than I expected, and for a moment, I thought about telling him everything, about Mark, about the affair, about the guilt that had been eating me alive for months. But the fear of losing him, of losing the life we'd built, held me back. I'm sorry, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. Ryan stood, running a hand through his hair. Maybe that's the problem, he said quietly. Maybe there's nothing left to say. He left the room, leaving me alone with the weight of his words and the crushing realization that the walls I had built to protect myself were closing in. The next day at practice, I tried to keep my distance from Mark, but he found me as I was gathering Ethan's things after the scrimmage. Lisa, he said softly, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. Not now, I said quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Please, he pressed, stepping closer. I need to know where we stand. There is no we, I said firmly, though my heart ached as I said it. This has to stop, Mark. I can't keep doing this. For a moment, he didn't respond, his eyes searching mine. Then, with a nod that felt like surrender, he stepped back. If that's what you want, he said quietly. I watched him walk away, the finality of his words settling over me like a heavy weight. It was what I wanted, what I needed, but it didn't feel like a victory. At home, Ryan's silence grew colder, and the distance between us felt insurmountable. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him, remained the one bright spot in my days, his laughter a reminder of what I stood to lose if everything fell apart. But as the cracks in my life grew wider, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was coming for me, whether I was ready or not. The days after cutting things off with Mark were a strange mix of relief and dread. On one hand, I felt a sliver of pride for finally doing the right thing, for taking the first step toward reclaiming control of my life. But the other part of me knew it wasn't over. The lies I'd told, the secrets I'd kept, they were still there, festering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Ryan was quieter than ever. He didn't ask questions anymore, didn't push me to explain myself. He went to work, came home, helped Ethan with homework, and went to bed, all without so much as a hint of the warmth that had once defined our relationship. It was as though he had resigned himself to the idea that whatever was wrong between us couldn't be fixed. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Ethan came into the kitchen, holding something in his hand. Mom, he said, his brow furrowed, I found this in the car. I turned to see him holding my phone, the screen lit up with a notification from Mark. I felt my stomach drop as I snatched it from his hand, my heart pounding. Thanks, sweetie, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. What's it about? He asked innocently, tilting his head. Just something about soccer, I said quickly, ruffling his hair. Go finish your homework, okay? He nodded, running off without a second thought, but my hands shook as I unlocked the phone. The message was simple, almost harmless on the surface, can we talk? Just once. But to me, it felt like a ticking time bomb. I deleted the message without responding, but the damage was already done. Ethan had seen it, and while he was too young to understand the implications, the realization that my carelessness could have exposed everything sent a chill through me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ryan's voice broke the silence. You've been jumpy lately, he said, his tone even but distant. I'm just tired, I said automatically, the excuse feeling hollow even as I said it. You know, he continued, his voice calm, I don't need you to tell me what's going on. I already know. My breath caught, and I turned to face him. What are you talking about? Ryan sat up, his expression unreadable. I've seen the way you've been acting. The way you avoid me, the way you light up whenever you're at practice. I might not know all the details, but I'm not stupid, Lisa. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth hung in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. I want to hear it from you, he said, his voice steady. Tell me the truth. Tears welled in my eyes as I sat up, my hands trembling in my lap. I made a mistake, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. A terrible mistake. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak, waiting for me to continue. It's over now, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. It never should have happened, and I hate myself for it, but it's over. I ended it. His silence was deafening, his eyes searching mine for something, answers, maybe, or remorse. Who? He asked finally, his voice low. Mark, I admitted, the name feeling like poison on my tongue. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Of course, he said quietly. The coach. I couldn't bring myself to respond, the weight of his disappointment crushing me. Do you love him? He asked, his voice trembling. No, I said quickly, the words spilling out before he could finish the question. It wasn't like that. It wasn't love. Then what was it? He asked, his tone a mix of anger and pain. What was worth throwing away everything we had? Tears streamed down my face as I tried to find the words. I don't know, I said finally. I was lonely. I felt invisible. But that's not an excuse, Ryan. It's not. I take full responsibility for what I did, and I'm so sorry. Ryan stood, pacing the room as he processed my confession. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked, his voice rising. To me? To Ethan? To us? I know, I sobbed, my hands covering my face. I know, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. For a moment, he didn't respond, his silence cutting deeper than any words could. Finally, he turned to me, his expression hardened. I don't know if we can come back from this, he said quietly. But for Ethan's sake, I'll try. The words were a small lifeline, but they felt more like a reminder of how far we'd fallen. As he left the room, I sat alone in the darkness, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like never before. The morning after my confession, the house felt eerily quiet. Ryan had slept on the couch, and when I came downstairs, he was already dressed and sipping his coffee, staring out the window. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, chattering about his day's plans, oblivious to the tension filling the room. Morning, I said softly, hoping to bridge the distance. Ryan glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable. Morning, he replied, his tone clipped. I sat down across from Ethan, forcing a smile as I listened to his excitement about an upcoming soccer game. It was strange, sitting there as though nothing had changed when everything felt like it had. Ryan stayed silent, his presence heavy but detached, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was the new normal. After breakfast, Ryan took Ethan to practice without a word to me. I watched them drive away, the sight of their car disappearing down the street leaving a hollow ache in my chest. Left alone in the house, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. The conversation from the night before played on a loop in my mind, each word a reminder of the damage I'd caused. I tried to distract myself with chores, but the silence only amplified my thoughts. When Ryan and Ethan returned, Ryan barely acknowledged me. He helped Ethan with his gear, then retreated to the backyard, leaving me standing in the kitchen, unsure of what to do. I knew he needed time, but the distance between us felt unbearable. That evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Ryan and I sat in the living room, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. Finally, I gathered the courage to speak. Ryan, I began, my voice trembling. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right. For you, for Ethan, for us. Ryan didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the coffee table. "I don't even know where to start," he said quietly. "How do you rebuild trust after something like this?" "I don't have all the answers," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Counseling, space, honesty, anything." Ryan finally met my gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and exhaustion. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not yet. But for Ethan's sake, I'm willing to try." His words were both a relief and a reminder of how far we had to go. The road ahead felt impossibly long, but his willingness to try gave me a sliver of hope. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Ryan and I began attending counseling, though our sessions were fraught with tension. Our counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Karen, encouraged us to be honest with each other, no matter how painful the truths might be. Ryan didn't hold back, airing his anger, his hurt, and his sense of betrayal in raw, unfiltered terms. "You made me feel like I wasn't enough," he said during one session, his voice trembling with emotion. "Like everything I've done for this family meant nothing to you." His words cut deep, but I knew he had every right to feel that way. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ryan. I didn't realize how lost I'd become until it was too late." Karen encouraged us to find small ways to reconnect outside of counseling, but even simple gestures felt fraught with tension. We started having coffee together in the mornings, sitting in awkward silence until one of us found something trivial to say. On weekends, we took Ethan to the park as a family, though the smiles we shared felt forced. Through it all, Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil beneath the surface. His laughter and excitement about soccer were a constant reminder of why Ryan and I were trying so hard to piece things back together. One evening, after a particularly emotional counseling session, Ryan and I sat together on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us. "Do you think we'll ever get back to the way things were?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan was quiet for a long moment before shaking his head. "I don't think we can," he said honestly. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we can build something better. Something real." His words brought tears to my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. "I want that too," I said softly. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like we were walking it together. The weeks that followed were marked by tentative steps forward. Ryan and I continued with counseling, each session peeling back another layer of the pain and resentment we had both been carrying. It wasn't easy, far from it, but there were moments when I saw glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had stood by me through so much. Karen, our counselor, encouraged us to focus on small victories. "Rebuilding trust takes time," she said during one session. "It's not about forgetting what happened, it's about finding a way to move forward together." We started with simple things, having dinner as a family without distractions, taking walks together in the evenings, and carving out time to talk without the pressure of solving everything at once. Some days were better than others. There were moments of connection that felt genuine, but there were also setbacks, times when the weight of the past threatened to pull us under. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching Ethan play in the yard, Ryan turned to me. "I've been thinking a lot about what Karen said," he began, his tone careful. "Which part?" I asked, bracing myself. "About rebuilding trust," he said. "I realized that it's not just about me trusting you, it's about us trusting each other. I need to believe that you want this as much as I do." "I do," I said quickly, my voice trembling with emotion. "I want this more than anything, Ryan. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm committed to making things right." He nodded, his gaze softening. "Then I think we have a chance," he said quietly. His words felt like a lifeline, a promise that we were on the same page, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. At the same time, I knew that rebuilding our relationship wouldn't erase the past. The affair with Mark had left scars that wouldn't fade easily, and there were still moments when the guilt and shame threatened to overwhelm me. But I also knew that those scars didn't have to define us. They could be reminders of how far we'd come, of the strength it took to confront our mistakes and fight for what mattered most. Mark, for his part, had stayed out of my life since our last conversation. He still coached Ethan's soccer team, but our interactions were strictly professional, and he respected the boundaries I had set. It wasn't easy seeing him at practices and games, but I reminded myself that the choices I made moving forward were what truly mattered. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had shaken our family, continued to thrive. His laughter and excitement about soccer were a constant reminder of why Ryan and I were fighting so hard to make things work. Every time I saw him smile, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to be the mother and partner that he deserved. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Ryan and I sat together on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I wasn't sure if we'd get to this point." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice soft. "But I'm glad we did," he said, reaching for my hand. "I'm not saying everything's perfect, but I think we're stronger for having gone through this. And I think we can be even stronger moving forward." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I squeezed his hand, gratitude swelling in my chest. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling. "Thank you for giving us a second chance." The journey wasn't over, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But as we sat together, our hands entwined, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't known in months. Ryan and I had faced one of the hardest trials of our relationship, and though the road to healing was long, we were walking it together. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we would make it, that love, though imperfect, was worth fighting for.